Lots of exciting new Macs. If you're unsure of what to get for music production, photo, or video editing within your budget, let me try to help. My name is Joven. Welcome to Project Beats. Before we dive in, if you like this type of video, please consider subscribing. Alright, if you're not sure which new Mac to get, which specs fit your workflow, and you're working with a limited budget, I hope that my experience and what I have learned can help you make a more informed buying decision. I'll try to make this as easy and as straightforward as possible. So to keep it simple, I'll divide this into two groups. Let's call the first group a sweet spot. This is you if you are doing photo or video editing or producing here and there, and maybe you are looking into doing more heavy work. You like to multitask, keep many tabs open, and have multiple apps running, or maybe 4K video edit every now and then with a couple of LUTs, or you produce and do about 40 to 80 tracks, maybe 100 tracks with multiple active plugins and a couple of virtual instruments, and you are on a budget. I do think this group represents the majority of creatives. The second group I would call if-then or actual pros. You do a bit more demanding and sustained workload. You don't mind spending a bit more, and of course, you need multitasking and faster turnaround time, and the keyword need, but you still want to save a bit. This will be our group 2. For the rest that does really demanding work and you have the budget for it, I don't think you need my help. Or maybe you just need a wingman in persuading your wife about your next big ticket purchase. I wholeheartedly support your buying decision. It's a very good investment. Okay, straight to the point. First group, the sweet spot. For the majority of creatives, I think the ideal spec would be M1 or M2 base SoC, spec'd up to 16 gig RAM and 512 SSD minimum. You will be set. Hit add to cart, take it and go.
Best price. Take it and go.
Now, the second group, if-then or pros, you guys don't mind spending a bit more and you need more headroom. I'd say you want to go M1 or M2 Pro, 16 or 32 gig RAM depending on what you need, and then 512 SSD minimum storage. But let's talk about the sweet spot. In real world, any new silicone Mac will handle most tasks any creative need, including the fanless new shiny MacBook Air if you really want to get it. And even the iPad Pros, especially now with the inclusion of a very promising early version of Logic Pro and Final Cut Pro for the iPad. Any one of them can do solid professional work, with the main difference being how fast it renders and the sustained workload capability. But of course, we want to be sure to get exactly what we need, as it can get expensive really fast, so that we try to avoid overspending unnecessarily. On the flip side, we know we can't update or upgrade these parts in the future, so we need to know it can serve us for at least a couple or more years. So why those specs? In the real world, the stock base model that comes with the 8 gig RAM and 256 SSD, they are slow for creative work. Not only do you not have enough space for files internally, but your SSD will be slow as well. So swap memory will be in play, especially during those demanding tasks, but it won't be of much help. That means those jitters and loading and reloading times, rendering, slower file transfers, or maybe even throttling depending on which Mac you get, can get annoying really fast. You will be limited with the tabs and apps you can have open for multitasking. So I would argue for majority of creatives, the sweet spot will be M1 or M2 chip with 16 gig RAM and a faster 512 SSD. With this spec, it is actually possible for you to do heavy work, even sustained workload, especially if you manage your projects. That means 4K editing is very doable, especially if you stick to a proxy workflow. For music production, you could do upwards of 100 tracks with proper project management. By the way, I might sound like I'm giving you a very conservative track count in music production, but this is all coming from my experience being a music producer and doing video editing for YouTube as well. The thing with music production, most of the third-party plugins still doesn't work completely well natively with silicone. not all at least. And we all know the horror of new Mac OS and how that plays with DAWs or editing software. And the plugins company we all know is very slow to adapt. Yes, we have Pro Tools and other DAWs working natively with silicone, but some plugins will be disabled. I'm still using Pro Tools and even Logic Pro on Rosetta just cause some dang plugins I use a lot still don't work. I know they are slowly updating, and keyword slowly.
2, 9.
But I digress. My point is, if you manage your projects well, which I think is good professional practice to keep your projects in check every step of the way, the sweet spot specs can do and will do some serious work. Save a bit more money, and you have a good workflow. I know I emphasize on project management a lot, but believe me, you don't want to be in that creative zone where you are flowing and you're getting great ideas left and right, and suddenly your computer bogs down and becomes in your way and you lose your train of thought. It's not going to be a good day. Trust me, project management, good habit. Okay, before I talk about the second group, if then or pros, let me give you some reference on my workflow with a Mac Mini I was using before that has specs less than what I'm recommending. So as I mentioned, I do a lot of music production and video editing, and my previous Mac was the Mac Mini M1 with 16 gigs of RAM and 256 storage. And every project was on external drive. Few things I like about it is it's cheap and still the cheapest entry to the Mac workflow. I also like that it has a fan so that even with the specs I have, throttling would be less of an issue and I could push it more with sustained heavy workload, which it did amazingly well. I did learn later on that the storage was slow and possibly causing some bottleneck in the system, so don't make the same mistake I did. When I'm editing, I do multiple video streams with grading, occasional 4K and even 8K sometimes. I do average about 6 to 8 HD video streams in the timeline. When I do music video with multiple camera angles, I would go upwards of about 10 to 15 HD streams on the Mac Mini. But towards the end of that project, it would pause and the timeline would start to stutter and drop frames. I didn't use proxies before, but I was still able to do some heavy work on that machine. Also, I was editing it on external drive and it's not even a fast storage. The max resolution I did before was about 4 streams of 8K footage that was shot on an Alpha A1. No proxies then with a light color grade and it did fine. Timeline started a bit, maybe drop a few frames in the timeline here and there, but I was still able to render that project. And for music productions, I average about 80 to 100 tracks per project with multiple active plugins and virtual sounds, and the Mac Mini handled it like a champ. But again, I do project management fairly well, but I did eventually upgrade to the M1 Pro 14-inch MacBook Pro with 32 gigs of RAM and more internal storage. That's what you see right there. Reason is I switched to mainly 4K editing, and I do a lot more tracks now in my production, doing more vocal productions as well. So that means doubled, tripled harmony stacks. And the goal was to eliminate all friction in the workflow as much as possible. But before you think, oh, I need that higher RAM, I need to get that shiny new M2 Pro Ultra Max, I'd say for majority of users, that's on a budget, of course. The sweet spot specs will take you farther than you think. Also, if you're a music producer or video editor on a budget, you probably also need a good interface, pre's, mics, monitors, or video gear, lenses, and whatnot. I know I do, so we all want to strike that balance on how we spend our hard-earned cash, right? Okay, now for the second group, if then or pros. You don't mind spending a bit more and you want that flexibility and headroom and you need faster turnaround time. Remember, need. And of course, you are actually in that professional field. You will benefit a lot from M1 or M2 Pro at least. If you think you need that extra headroom for virtual instruments, layers upon layers of track stacks, and you gotta have them active, you could bring it up to 64 gig RAM, especially if you have the cash for it. I would say having 32 gig RAM is a bit of a luxury already, because most of the time, even with live looping show, I've seen people be very successful with a very old Mac and just 16 gigs of RAM. Again, it's all about project management. If you're Jacob Collier and you're averaging a whopping 300 to 600 tracks in your music productions, or you do heavy 4K and 8K 12-bit raw video editing demanding 3D graphics workload, or you just want to burn some cash, again, you don't need my help, but you're probably looking at M2 Max or even M2 Ultra. Go live the dream. I still have some drums to buy. With the specs out of the way, which Mac should you get? If you notice, I keep saying M1 and M1 Pro because I still think they are a killer option even in 2023. And you can get them for much, much less. Well, not much, but less. If you check the used market, or not even used, you can check the refurbished section from Apple, or you can get them at a discount new in Amazon or eBay or whatnot. You can save a lot with those and have a really good, very capable machine for much less. So budget-wise, I think is the first one you should check. Now, on to new Macs. If you are mostly desktop, maybe occasional travel here and there, and you don't mind lugging a bit of bulk, my top recommendation is still the Mac Mini M1 or M2 16 gig RAM 512 SSD. You can add a portable monitor, keyboard, and mouse. You have a power budget Mac that can travel. If you're looking at working with teams or remote or collaborations online and also looking to get a NAS in the future, I would highly encourage you to get that 10 GBE network card option. If you can afford it, you can bring it up to 24 gig RAM, which I think still not a bad idea. You have this option on the Mac Mini and the MacBook Air. And again, what I love about the Mac Mini is the fan. Compared to the same spec MacBook Air, you won't have issues with throttling, which is very real. This is where your Mac's performance is limited because of the heat due to sustained workload. But then if you are traveling creative nomad, the MacBook Air M1 or M2 would be the next best budget option. Next step up is a bit tricky, and this is how Apple get us. You could get the M2 Pro Mac Mini with more Thunderbolt ports, but in total, if we add the 10 GBE network card, the difference will be 400 or about 300 USD to jump up to the Mac Studio base model, which gives you more ports, SD card reader, 10 GBE network, all built in, and a more powerful SoC, which is the M2 Max. I'd say if you're a pro, this is the Mac to get. If you're not gonna travel a lot and you have an older laptop or maybe an iPad Pro for other mobile lightweight tasks, I do think it's worth it to hold off and save up a bit and dive headfirst for the Mac Studio M2 Max. If you have a limited budget, then maybe the Mac Mini M1 M2 Pro is for you. But of course, you could always check for sale or discount with reseller or check the refurbished units from Apple and try to get it on a deal. If your priority is mobility, then be prepared to spend a bit more, or just know that for about the same price of the Mac Studio M2 Max, you will have a less powerful spec. If you're okay with that, then the MacBook Pro with the M2 Pro chip, 16 or 32 gig RAM depending on what you need, plus 512 SSD would be a killer option. Again, the fan here is the big difference between the MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro. That little fan with a bit of compromise with the weight and bulk will give you more headroom for more sustained and demanding workflow. Also, you are getting that Liquid Retina XDR display with the MacBook Pro that you can actually rely on video and photo editing. If you want that same display on the Mac Studio, you're going to spend upwards of 2,000 SGD. But what if you don't have to choose between powerful Mac and mobility? Okay, hear me out. Let's take a powerful Mac that can be mobile and desktop anytime you want. Say a MacBook Pro 14-inch M2 Max. That would cost you about 4,500 SGD. If you're willing to drop that much, how about this? If we go into The refurbished section, you could get about the same spec Mac Studio M1 Max. But wait, it's not mobile, you say. Then with that savings, you could get another Mac. This time it can be very lightweight, say maybe for tracking or organizing or prepping your project. And then you can resume your work on the Mac Studio later on. This way, you don't need it to be super powerful, right? Now you could look at getting MacBook Air or even an iPad Pro. Personally, I would say go for the iPad Pro for that other things you could do with the iPad. And it has that XDR Liquid Retina display, so you could rely on that for editing. And you could get a cheaper big screen like this. But then again, if you need that much power and you are always on the go, then of course the MacBook Pro Max will make more sense for you. Final note on specs and which Mac to get. If you are on a heavy demanding workload, you're always on deadline, and you are actually losing money with every second you lose on rendering time, go for the M1 or M1 Pro or higher. But if you're not, I would argue most users will be happy with the M1, M2, 16GB RAM, 512 SSD as the sweet spot budget workhorse. You may just have to wait a little bit more for rendering, get a coffee or tea or something, but hopefully your purchase makes sense for you. Lastly, storage solution. You may be wondering why I keep saying 512 SSD. Okay, I got you. I say 512 minimum because it's faster than the 256 gig. That's all. That way you get a balanced, powerful Mac. Also, you don't actually need a lot of storage for critical operating system files. Let me give you a storage solution on a budget. If you're more audio production or photo editing, get an external SSD. It doesn't need to be super fast. You can get 2TB SSD with transfer speeds of about 600 to 1 gigabit. Is that right? Per second read and write speed. That would cost about 100 to 160. That should be more than enough as a scratch project drive. For comparison, internal 2TB SSD from Apple costs about 900 SGD. Now, if you're more video editor with high resolution files, you might want to get a DIY Thunderbolt SSD, which is one of these guys. But more on this on the next video. These will rival the speed of the Mac internal SSD. You can get a 4TB SSD. This kit right here. This is 4TB. And a Thunderbolt enclosure. That kit is 400 SGD. For comparison, upgrading to 4TB internally from Apple would cost you 1800 SGD. That's about 1300 USD. When you are done with your projects, you can just move and transfer files to archive them to a slower drive. Usually 8TB external drive costs around $200. And that's how you solve storage. All of these items will be linked down in the description below. Alright, in closing, you just need to sit down and think, not overthink. Think what you really need exactly, and I'd say the sweet spot spec will be enough for most. Step up only if you are maxing out your current machine and you know you need more. That's about it for this video. If you enjoyed it, drop me a like. If I missed something, let me know in the comments below. And if you'd like to support the channel, best way is by subscribing. Alright, see you in the next project.